And you know what? That's a lot of tinkering around with something that can make your scalp red and flaky, just to, try to get some hair growth, right? But guys, here's the thing. By delivering minoxidil sulfate itself in a liposomal solution, we step outside the enzyme and retinoid dynamic altogether. So, why not think about using that instead? Doesn't that just make more sense, right? You're just getting the active minoxidil sulfate in a liposome, and minoxidil sulfate is now stabilized, right? It doesn't have to interact with the aqueous solution, which would typically make it an unstable compound. So now you have this stabilized minoxidil sulfate, the actual thing that you're trying to sort of reach the conversion to by using topical retinoids. Now you just have it in this liposomal solution. So you saw the title, and you're probably excited, so let's get into this video. For the past 2 years, my team at Sulfogenz Therapeutics has been working to bring the formulation that may offer improved stability and potentially enhance follicular delivery. And now, after all this time, it's finally here. You see, topical minoxidil is known as a prodrug and must convert it to minoxidil sulfate with the enzyme sulfur transferase, also known as SALT1A1. As many as 4 in 10 users simply just don't have enough of that enzyme, so the solution never turns into its active form and they see little or no regrowth, an efficacy bottleneck dermatologists have acknowledged for decades. But I'm not here to crap all over minoxidil itself, right? Most regular topical minoxidil users do see somewhat modest results, but not exactly what many would call hyper-responder results, where you would see a substantial amount of hair growth and thickness present across the scalp. I would tend to say that most people do respond somewhat, where they're getting some regrowth from topical minoxidil. It's always about that sort of degree of growth. But even then, whether the topical minoxidil isn't working as well as you hoped, or maybe you're just not a responder at all, the next alternative that many people recommend from online YouTubers, such as maybe myself on some occasions, and even doctors and dermatologists, would be low-dose oral minoxidil between 0.5 milligram up to 5 milligram a day. Many may turn to oral minoxidil if they find that regular topical minoxidil that they're using doesn't have that sort of edge. However, there are some issues in doing so. And we have to acknowledge this with all sort of treatments, although with some, especially when it comes to finasteride, it tends to be exaggerated in its risk profile. But we must acknowledge this. Nothing comes without risks. And using minoxidil in general, especially oral minoxidil, has been associated with unpredictable cardiovascular events such as tachycardia and even, albeit in some rare cases, pericardial effusion. This is where fluid builds up around the heart sac. Now again, the latter case is pretty rare, but nevertheless the risks are there. Low-dose oral minoxidil has been found to have side effects that are entirely dose-independent, meaning between 0.5 milligram, again up to 5 milligram, like I said before, the thing that's going to determine whether or not you have that serious side effect, like pericardial effusion, are genetic idiosyncrasies. So again, it comes down to your genes. But hey, look, if you're not having side effects to oral minoxidil, then it stands to be a pretty good therapy. You wouldn't have to worry about putting this pesky fluid in your scalp. You just pop the pill and forget about it. But that's with the assumption that it works better than topical minoxidil. If we look at the randomized clinical trial by Penha et al., titled, quote, Oral Minoxidil versus Topical Minoxidil for Male Androgenetic Alopecia, unquote, published in JAMA Dermatology in June 2024, in 90 men over 24 weeks, 5 milligram oral minoxidil taken once daily produced no statistically significant advantage over applying 5% topical solution of minoxidil twice daily. So, in other words, swallowing the pill didn't beat a topical solution of regular 5% topical minoxidil. I mean, I get it, maybe it's more convenient to use, but let's be clear, there was no statistically significant advantages when it came to hair growth. Yet, The oral minoxidil carried a higher rate of systemic side effects such as headaches, and because low-dose oral minoxidil is obviously taken orally, as the name suggests, it has the ability to induce hypertrichosis, and that grows hair all over your body. Now, for some people, they might say, that's not an issue, I can just shave. But yes, that is an issue for other people, especially when you have hair follicle conditions like inverted acne, also known as HS, or hidradenitis suppurativa. And this is a chronic inflammatory skin condition that causes painful recurring boils and abscesses, and really, it's kind of like having an ingrown hair. So if you're taking this medication and it's encouraging hair growth and you're having hypertrichosis in your armpits, your groin, your buttocks, where these sort of HS boils typically exist, that's not going to be helpful, right? Again, this is assuming you don't have that in your scalp. Obviously, if you have that in your scalp, you probably shouldn't be using minoxidil because it will encourage it and make things worse. But anyway, I digress. So now we know that 5% topical minoxidil twice daily is pretty much the equivalent of 5 mg oral minoxidil once daily. Okay, so maybe oral minoxidil at 5 mg may not be all that effective. Okay, sure. But what about simply using a higher concentration of topical minoxidil beyond 5%, perhaps 10%, or maybe even 15%? Well, according to a 2022 meta-analysis and critical review by Singh et al. In Clinical and Experimental Dermatology, titled, quote, "Does topical minoxidil at concentrations higher than 5% provide additional clinical benefit?" Unquote, we find that simply cranking topical minoxidil past the 5% mark isn't the magical fix that people hope for. The authors point out that minoxidil's poor solubility makes 7.5% the practical ceiling in propylene glycol vehicles. Anything stronger tends to crystallize on the scalp as the solvents flash off, which locks the drug in a sort of powdery residue instead of letting it sink into the follicle. And they actually note that this sort of crystallization of the excess minoxidil that wasn't able to be absorbed into the skin will ultimately reduce the effective absorption and also limits the therapeutic benefit, and really it can also potentially lead to irritation of the scalp. So this sounds like a bad time to me. The paper also mentions some clinical evidence in the literature, such as the following. So first, there was a 24-week study comparing 15% to 5% topical minoxidil, and surprisingly enough, it actually did report more growth with the 15% topical minoxidil concentration, but this only occurred transiently. That is, the advantage disappeared once the crystallization caught up. And again, crystallization is occurring because there is too much minoxidil in this sort of propylene glycol solution, so not all of it can properly dissolve into the solvent. And over time, as you're using it, it kind of becomes more and more concentrated, because you really can't ensure that you're getting the exact amount each time in your pipette, so inherently there will be some sort of crystallization as you use the solution as you go on. A separate randomized trial found no extra benefit at 10% versus 5%, attributing the plateau to a sort of saturation of absorption kinetics, essentially meaning that the hair follicle can only take up so much before these proteins called transporters, which move around the minoxidil in and out of the follicle, essentially reach a point where they can only be so effective at doing that particular process. There's also the dilemma of the local sulfotransferase enzymatic activity levels. And like many of you guys may know, in order to get minoxidil sulfate, the active ingredient that actually grows hair, you need to have an enzyme present in your skin called the sulfotransferase enzyme, or the SALT1A1 enzyme. If you don't have much of it, then you're not going to be a good responder. Now, I want you guys to pay attention to this point here because we will be coming back to this shortly. Finally, another point is that off-label 10% up to 5% topical minoxidil blends usually are compounded with even more propylene glycol, which frequently backfire in real-world use because the extra glycol tends to inflame the scalp and push people to quitting the formulation. Which is why the meta-analysis concludes that higher concentrations of regular topical minoxidil are halted by chemistry, not theory. Once the solution crystallizes, the benefits vanish rapidly. Okay, so why not just use tretinoin along with topical minoxidil, as some of you may be thinking in the audience? Well, I mean, by all means you can, and there is some clinical evidence that actually shows using topical retinoids like tretinoin may increase the sulfur transferase enzymatic activity and thus in turn increase the amount of minoxidil sulfate you have, and it could make you a better responder to minoxidil overall. According to two key papers, simply layering a retinoid on top of minoxidil seems to have some promise. The first paper being, quote, Topical Tretinoin for Hair Growth Promotion, unquote, by Bozzano et al., 1986. In this 56-patient split scalp trial, 0.1% tretinoin by itself produced measurable terminal regrowth in around 58% of androgenetic alopecia subjects after a year, and when the same tretinoin was paired with just 0.5% minoxidil, which is 1/10 of the usual strength, being 5% topical minoxidil, the response rate jumped to 66%. The authors argued that retinoic acid's well-known effects on epithelial turnover, vascular proliferation, and keratinocyte differentiation could be awakening miniaturized follicles that minoxidil alone can't reach. The second paper being, quote, Tretinoin enhances minoxidil response in androgenetic alopecia patients by upregulating follicular sulfotransferase enzymes, unquote, by Sharma et al., 2019, from Dermatologic Therapy. Here in this study, 20 men and women first had their follicles tested with the minoxidil response test. After 5 consecutive days of 0.1% tretinoin cream, 43% of subjects who had initially tested as non-responders were reclassified as responders thanks to a statistically significant lift in their follicular SALT1A1 or sulfur transferase enzymatic activity. So in plain English, tretinoin turned the enzyme dial up high enough that a topical minoxidil course would now work for nearly half of the people who otherwise would have failed it. Well, presumably based on the responsive test that they use. We don't know what happened long term because this thing only went on for 5 days. So together with these studies, it kind of shows us that maybe a topical retinoid, maybe, don't get carried away with this one, but maybe it could stimulate some hair regrowth on its own. I don't think that's true anymore. That was a really old study from Bozzano et al. But also B, flip the sulfur transferase enzymatic switch so more minoxidil gets converted to its active sulfate, being minoxidil sulfate. But we need to consider a few things here about this sort of topical retinoid and whether or not it's even better. So let's zoom out for a second and look at what has to happen before a drop of ordinary topical minoxidil ever becomes the hair growth molecule we want it to be. So number one, we have to look at skin penetration. The alcohol propylene glycol vehicle that we typically use for topical minoxidil has to first wiggle its way past the outer layer of the skin. This is called the stratum corneum, and then it has to reach the follicular outer root sheath, or the ORS. Here, tretinoin can help by increasing the skin's permeability, and in doing so, tretinoin will cause accelerated epithelial cell turnover, increased differentiation markers, and overall enhanced metabolic enzyme expression. So, in other words, in English, right? Tretinoin does not directly induce SALT1A1 gene expression, but it enhances the skin's enzymatic capacity overall by altering the epidermal microenvironment, especially in the ORS and the upper follicular epithelium. So this is not necessarily a direct approach. So for this one point, on point number one right now, let's just recap real quick. We're pretty much increasing the absorption of minoxidil by kind of, increasing cellular turnover, but also we're trying to enhance those cells so they have a greater capacity to potentially maybe convert more minoxidil into minoxidil sulfate, because all of these cells, they have enhanced sort of enzymatic expressions due to tretinoin's activity. So point number 2 would be the enzymatic switch on. Anyway, inside the ORS, the sulforotransferase enzyme, particularly the SALT1A1 enzyme, adds a sulfate group which turns the inactive prodrug minoxidil into the active hair growth stimulant minoxidil sulfate. But there's probably going to be someone saying in the audience, okay, so how do we know minoxidil sulfate is even important for this sort of process? Well, a 1992 study by Johnson et al. Titled, quote, "Minoxidil sulforotransferase, a marker of human keratinocyte differentiation," unquote, further explored the biological context of minoxidil sulfation in human hair follicle cells. Published in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology, the study identified minoxidil sulforotransferase as an early marker of keratinocyte differentiation. This enzyme activity was shown to be distinct from other sulforotransferases, like those involved in cholesterol metabolism. Notably, the activity of minoxidil sulforotransferase increased as keratinocytes underwent differentiation, which suggests its role is tightly regulated in epidermal development. The researchers confirmed the specificity of this enzyme through the use of a selective inhibitor. By using this inhibitor and observing a reduction and elimination in the expected sulfation activity, they were able to confirm that the activity measured was specific to minoxidil sulforotransferase, also known as minoxidil sulfate. This strengthened their claim that minoxidil's effectiveness hinges on this unique enzyme pathway, thereby reinforcing that the enzyme's role, specifically sulforotransferase, is crucial in hair follicle function and minoxidil metabolism. So now let's move on to point number 3 here, and we're going to call this traffic control, right? So now, this part is going to get pretty niche, so please pay attention. We will be revisiting it in probably another video or another part in this video. I don't know. But we're going to revisit it. So the newly made minoxidil sulfate must be pumped out of the keratinocytes by the efflux transporter protein known as ABCC3. And then it has to be shuttled back into another group of cells called the dermal papilla cells by the uptake transporter protein known as SLC22A9. Try saying that 5 times fast. Anyway, these proteins are controlled by, well, you guessed it. What do you think it is? Your genes, right? And that sort of 2-step export, re-import sort of loop is the rate-limiting sort of cog in this whole process. So if you clog either pathway, whether you're clogging ABCC3 or let's call it SCL, the SLC protein, you're going to have some issues, and then, the drug levels are going to sort of collapse in the hair follicle unit. I also want to note here that another way tretinoin may be working is by increasing keratinocyte differentiation, like I mentioned before, right? Nothing new. But this in turn could indirectly boost the activity of both the SALT1A1 enzyme and also the efflux protein ABCC3, because it's presumable that these proteins may be more active in mature keratinocytes, right? They have grown, they have fully differentiated, and now they have more capacity to actually utilize these particular enzymes and transport proteins. So by promoting differentiation, you might also be getting higher number of these sort of keratinocytes overall within the outer root sheath or the ORS of the hair follicle. And now, again, because now you have more keratinocytes kind of working together, this is sort of my theory, each will now have the enzymatic capacity to carry out more sulfation. So it's kind of like we have now built more factories, so in theory we can produce more things so long as we have the raw material to do so. So in effect, this means more potential conversion sites for minoxidil to become minoxidil sulfate, as well as in theory, improved export of the ABCC3 transporter protein. And I want to go deeper into this, right? So it might be the case that, and I will posit this here, that when keratinocytes differentiate, they not only express higher levels of metabolic enzymes like SALT1A1 or sulfur transferase enzyme, but also upregulate transport proteins needed to handle the increased biochemical activity that comes with maturation, right? So that would be that ABCC3 efflux transporter protein. And while there's no direct study showing that tretinoin upregulates ABCC3, specifically in follicular keratinocytes, there is broader evidence across epithelial tissues. For example, a 2009 paper by Li et al. Titled, quote, Retinoid Responsive Transcriptional Changes in Epidermal Keratinocytes, unquote, showed that all trans-retinoic acid, or tretinoin, rapidly modifies the expression of over 3,000 genes, including those linked to membrane transport and detoxification. So that was a lot to review, but aren't I supposed to be here shilling for liposomal minoxidil sulfate? Why am I just rambling about, hey, you can just use tretinoin and, then it may be able to just make your hair better. You don't even have to use liposomal minoxidil sulfate. Well, let's kind of slow down a bit, right? It seems today that the focus is attempting to accommodate for the variations and limitations of the sulfotransferase enzymatic activity by using retinoids. But this isn't a direct approach by any means, right? And even so, we need to be honest to an extent. These studies on topical retinoids enhancing minoxidil's efficacy aren't exactly the best. Although the 3 retinoid booster papers remain the best known citations, a closer look shows that each leaves practical questions hanging. And look, guys, these questions matter if you're going to be weighing retinoids plus regular minoxidil against a ready-made liposomal minoxidil sulfate. First, the Bazzano et al. 1986 paper tested tretinoin. They essentially had a lotion that used 0.5% minoxidil with 0.1% tretinoin. Now, first off, 0.5% minoxidil is only 1/10 the strength most men use today, which is typically 5%. And because 0.5% minoxidil is subtherapeutic for many patients, any quote-unquote 66% regrowth they reported tells us more about how tretinoin behaves in a low drug environment than how it would interact with the 5% solutions people actually use today. The vehicle was also very thick. It was like a thick cream, and it wasn't fast drying, and there were a lot of issues with it. So that probably isn't really practical. Next, if we look at the Sharma et al. 2019 paper, it showed that, again, applying 0.1% topical tretinoin nightly for just 5 days seemed to increase the sulfotransferase enzymatic expression in baseline non-responders from a score of 0.26 to one of 0.35. And on their sort of specific minoxidil responsive scale, that sort of movement made 43% of these non-responders into responders. And that's impressive on paper, but notice what isn't there. They never measured the minoxidil sulfate levels in the follicle itself. And to be real, they never followed the patients long enough to count hairs, and they never tested whether the boost persists once tretinoin is stopped. So in other words, we know the enzyme flickered upward, but we don't know if that flicker translates to more meaningful regrowth or if it even lasts beyond a weekend. Finally, the Shin et al. 2007 paper tried to make daily life easier by downgrading tretinoin to 0.01% and giving it only once at night, hoping that would let patients skip the morning minoxidil dose. The gamble fell flat. After 24 weeks, the once daily 5% minoxidil plus 0.01% tretinoin arm delivered identical hair counts and global ratings to the plain 5% minoxidil used twice daily. So the take home here is not that tretinoin never helps, rather it hints at a threshold effect. And that is that below roughly 0.1%, you may simply not turn on enough sulfotransferase for it to matter. Pushing tretinoin to 0.1% or switching to an even stronger retinoid carries its own baggage too. Take, for example, tazorotine, which activates the retinoic acid receptor beta with an EC50, and basically EC50 stands for half maximal effective concentration. Basically, it helps us find out how much of a substance is needed to create a certain effect. But anyway, tazorotine activates this receptor with an EC50 of around 2 to 3 nanomolar, which is about 1 order of magnitude more potent than tretinoin, while adapalene engages the retinoic acid receptor beta at about 2.2 nanomolar. Now guys, the lower the nanomolar score, that means you need less of that particular substance, which means it is more potent, just as a bit of a note to help you out. But shows virtually no affinity for the retinoid X receptor, the co-receptor activator that is thought to drive the sulfotransferase enzymatic activity upregulation. And also another thing worth flagging is the catagen risk. So let's kind of talk about this real quick. So in 2005, Nakamura M. et al. Published a paper titled, quote, "Towards dissecting the pathogenesis of retinoid-induced hair loss, all trans-retinoic acid induces premature hair follicle regression, catagen, by upregulation of transforming growth factor beta-2 in the dermapapilla," unquote, in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology. Working with isolated human scalp hair follicles in culture, so in a petri dish of some kind, they showed that even nanomolar levels of all trans-retinoic acid, tretinoin, cut hair shaft elongation in half within 48 hours and push roughly 80% of follicles into premature catagen by day 6 versus only 30% in untreated controls. Now, molecular staining confirmed that tretinoin dramatically increased TGF-beta 2 expressions. And this is the very cytokine that's best known for triggering the catagen switch, a sort of premature end to the hair growth stage of the hair cycle known as anagen. When the team neutralized the TGF-beta signaling, they could only partially rescue the hair growth. So this sort of cemented the link between high retinoid load and early regression. Now, again, this was an in vitro sort of study, maybe ex vivo in vitro sort of study, so it may kind of be different in an actual sort of setting where you're putting it on your scalp, but it does suggest that a sort of chronic use of retinoids, whether topically or orally, there could be some sort of theoretical risk where you're getting a sort of premature shedding. So that's something you might want to sort of consider, okay? And this is kind of a problem because of the Sharma 2019 paper where it shows that there was some sort of threshold where you needed to be at 0.1% to get that sort of responsivity. 0.1% is a pretty high concentration, right? And that concentration is orders of magnitude above the nanomolar doses that Nakamura et al.'s group used to kind of push these ex vivo hair follicles towards catagen. Clinically, dermatologists already see this tension, where higher potency retinoids such as tazorotine or adapalene carry more power to activate nuclear receptors, yet they also unleash classic retinoid downsides. This would be xerosis, which is also known as dry skin. Desquamation, which refers to the peeling or the scales that you get on your skin, right? So in other words, skin peeling. Photosensitivity, you should already know what that means, and potentially a TGF-beta driven effluvium where you're actually causing hair to shed. Again, this is probably with chronic use of whether topically or orally administered retinoids. So, while retinoids can, under very specific circumstances, increase sulfotransferase enzymatic activity, the same pathway can probably cause shedding too. That is, if you're using it chronically. And look, guys, 0.1% topical tretinoin is a pretty high concentration, and if you have to use this concentration like the Sharma et al. Study shows, where it actually made people responders, this is well above the 0.025% or the 0.05% strengths that acne patients already find to be drying out their skin. So dermatologists therefore have to balance the potency against tolerability. We have to note that high-affinity retinoids are notorious for disrupting the skin barrier and activating the TRPV1, and that would be the transient receptor potential vanoid 1 ion channel. So this specific receptor is a molecular sensor for heat and physical pain. When activated, it allows calcium to rush into the nerve endings, amplifying the perception of burning and stinging. That sounds horrible, man. In 2001, Koyama et al. Published a study in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology showing that retinoic acid significantly increases TRPV1 expression in human keratinocytes, making the skin far more responsive to this sort of stimuli. Later, Moore et al. 2009 confirmed that topical retinoids not only induce TRPV1 expression, but also sensitize existing receptors, increasing nociceptive signals even in the absence of visible inflammation. And just so you know, nociceptive pain is caused by a sort of damage to the body's tissues. You may feel a sort of aching, burning, throbbing, or sort of like itching kind of pain, maybe all at once. And basically, it's your body's way of signaling to you, hey, you shouldn't touch that, or let's get away from that sort of bad stimuli because it's actually damaging us, right? But that isn't productive if you've already placed that topical on you. So if you have any allergy to anything, just be aware of your allergies. But still, retinoids do carry that sort of risk of having that as a side effect. Sometimes, though, it does go away. But what this means clinically is that high-strength retinoids can directly provoke pain and even neurogenic inflammation, even in people without sensitive skin. And when you consider that TRPV1 is also involved in itch signaling and even mast cell activation, the likelihood of adverse events like stinging, erythema, or burning scales up dramatically. It gets worse in the presence of UV light as well. Retinoids are notoriously photosensitizing, and exposure to sunlight while using products like, let's say, 0.1% tretinoin or even toritine or adapalene significantly increases the risk of erythema and even chemical burns. In a 2005 clinical trial by Kang et al., patients applying 0.1% tretinoin experienced increased UV-induced erythema and skin peeling, especially when sunscreen compliance was inconsistent. So, you gotta use sunscreen if you're using retinoids, as we've always known. And while newer retinoids like adapalene and toritine have been formulated with more receptor selectivity, they still come with the usual suspects, right? Dryness, peeling, irritation, and also some sun sensitivity or photosensitivity. So, when you're losing your hair on your scalp, you don't have much of a defense against those pesky UV rays. So, unless you're using sunscreen on your scalp, which I don't think many of you are, or if you're wearing some sort of protective hat or covering, you might be putting yourself at risk in some ways. Even if you put on the tretinoin at night, you still in the morning should be using some kind of sunscreen. But it's kind of hard to get that sunscreen in your scalp, so why even use it anyway? So when putting it all together, the literature suggests that there is a ladder of efficacy when it comes to topical retinoids with minoxidil use, but there's also some risks too, and we can conceptualize this in the strength percentages and also chemical differences. So firstly, we see a subtherapeutic tretinoin range at less than or equal to 0.01%, where there is negligible enzyme impact and no clinical edge. The high-dose 0.1% tretinoin gives a sort of measurable, maybe short-lived enzyme bump, we don't know, but there is a common irritation and you are putting yourself at risk, when it comes to UV light and sensitivity. If you are going to the ultra-potent gamble here, where you're looking at toritine or maybe even adapalene at 0.3% or even 1% or 3%, I've seen some crazy formulations out there at 3%. That tends to be more medicated, I think. Those may have a theoretical impact on increasing the enzymatic activity, but they have higher EC50 scores as they are agonists of either the retinoic acid receptor beta or the retinoid X receptor. But they're pretty potent, so you have to be careful. And chronic use can potentially lead to a shed or a trigger shed at some point in your treatment. And you know what? That's a lot of tinkering around with something that can make your scalp red and flaky, just to, try to get some hair growth, right? But guys, here's the thing. By delivering minoxidil sulfate itself in a liposomal solution, we step outside the enzyme and retinoid dynamic altogether. So, why not think about using that instead? Doesn't that just make more sense, right? You're just getting the active minoxidil sulfate in a liposome, and minoxidil sulfate is now stabilized, right? It doesn't have to interact with the aqueous solution, which would typically make it an unstable compound. So now you have this stabilized minoxidil sulfate in this liposomal solution.
And just to be clear, again, some of the studies I did mention are not directly about Sulfogenz. They are contextualized for educational and informational purposes. So, let's see what Sulfogenz has to provide. Sulfogenz is much more than just minoxidil sulfate. It's packed with cosmetic benefits designed to give your hair a fuller, healthier look. So instead of using propylene glycol, which is a known irritant, we use glycerin. And glycerin is a humectant that has the ability to pull moisture into your hair shafts. So essentially, it helps the hair stay hydrated. And because of this, it may lead to a more plumpier sort of visible appearance. We also include vitamin E as an antioxidant, helping protect against environmental stressors while also imparting a soft, natural sheen. In Sulfogenz, we also have phosphatidylcholine, which supports your scalp's barrier function, leaving the skin beneath your hair feeling smoother, softer, and better hydrated overall. Now, another thing that I would like to note is that we've removed ethanol from the solution without compromising stability and delivery. Instead, we use a blend of plant-based oils, natural butters, and gentle moisturizers to keep the scalp, as well as the formula itself, lightweight. Ingredients like shea butter, sunflower oil, and skin-friendly lipids help condition the scalp and the hair without feeling greasy, making this a smooth and effective option for daily cosmetic care. Finally, we also have the lecithin component, and this is a gentle plant-derived protein that works to reduce visible dullness on the hair strands itself and also improve scalp tone and texture, giving your roots a natural lift and vibrant bounce as well. So while Sulfogenz does include liposomally stabilized minoxidil sulfate, it's the blend of glycerin, vitamin E, phosphatidylcholine, and lecithin wrapped in a sebum-compatible liposome that truly transforms the look and feel of your hair. So there's a real cosmetic benefit and opportunity when it comes to using Sulfogenz.
So visit www.folligenz.com, that's FOLLIGENZ.com, to check it out. And I'll leave that link in the description and the pinned comment. Guys, so excited. Hopefully we can get this rolling, and hopefully this impresses. Anyway, see you on the next one. Peace.